Good morning to everybody and welcome to this Kratos webinar on Birmingham, the Challenge. My name is Sean Anstey, I'm the Executive Director for Advisory, Public Affairs and PR at Kratos, and it's fantastic to have you with us today. We're going to have a really interesting and interactive discussion, so we want your thoughts and opinions as we go through the next hour, and I'll make sure that I tell you how to do that in a second. So just before we do, a little bit about Kratos. Kratos is a specialist local government consultancy advising on public affairs, advisory services and planning engagement, based in London, Manchester, Southampton, Bristol, and cover clients nationwide. And so this is the next in our series of webinars that we've hosted over the last 6 or 7 weeks, and it is fantastic to have the panel that we have today. Just before I introduce the panel, we just wanted to acknowledge that perhaps the diversity is not as diverse as we would like it to be. That is not through a lack of trying, but we will have a diversity of debate today. And so to do that, we are going to hear from Chris Naylor, who is the Interim Chief Executive, recently appointed Chief Executive of Birmingham City Council. Chris joins Birmingham from Barking and Dagenham, and has previously had a long career in local government, covering local authorities such as Barnet, Tower Hamlets and Hammersmith and Fulham. So moving out of the capital and into the Midlands over the last few weeks. And we're going to hear from Nathan Cornish. Nathan is Director at Urban Splash, been with Splash since 2002 and responsible for some of their iconic regeneration schemes and some significant developments in Birmingham, sure Nathan will touch on. And then we're going to get some reflections and responses from Jed Sweeney, the Joint Managing Director of Carney Sweeney, over 23 years experience in a wide range of planning disciplines, and established Carney Sweeney in 2019, based in Birmingham and London. And then finally from Ian Cloud, the Acting Director of Inclusive Growth at Birmingham City Council. Again, extensive experience of strategic planning, local planning, project management and site delivery. And so we're looking forward now to the contributions that we're going to have from everybody. If you are tweeting, please use the hashtag #AskKratos. And the questions as we go through the debate, if you can put them into the Q&A box that's just at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and if you pick up that Q&A, we'll come to the questions and make sure that we get through as many as we possibly can. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask Chris to give us some thoughts on, Chris, your first 3 weeks, and then broader reflections, I think, on Birmingham, the challenge, and maybe Birmingham, the opportunity. And if I can, hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and hello everybody. It's nice to almost see you all, and to be honest with you, I am really looking forward to just getting back to normal now. What about you? But I've sort of had enough of all of this. But anyway, in the meantime, nice to see you all virtually. So as Sean said, my name's Chris Naylor. I've just recently been appointed as the Interim Chief Executive in Birmingham, a role that I'm formally taking on for the next 12 months. But certainly the approach I'm taking since arriving there is that I'm sort of here. This is it now, and certainly the mandate I've been given by the members, the leader, and the cabinet in Birmingham is to kind of crack on. And I'll say a little bit more about what cracking on means in a moment or two. Just a sort of a notion of sort of caution and caveat to what I'm about to say. As Sean mentioned, I've been now with Birmingham for since I think halfway through my 4th week, so 3.5 weeks. And unfortunately, I spent one of those weeks in bed, having had an emergency appendix operation a week last Saturday. So it's not been an amazing start, but here we are, and I'm feeling much better. I'd have a renewed admiration for women who have cesarean sections. So my scar's about a quarter of theirs, and it was bloody painful. So well done on that. Now, I was broadly going to start by saying 3 things to kick us off, and I'm going to deliberately keep these reasonably high level because I suspect we'll get into some of the detail over the next hour or so. I suppose the first observation to make is that Birmingham, like many places, I think, does have a number of challenges in front of it. They are fiscal. I was just speaking yesterday to the council's finance director, and the impact of COVID is potentially huge on the council's finances. So they're fiscal, they're demographic. We've got a rapidly changing population with different needs. But they're also, I think, there are a set of sort of broader challenges that I think we're only now really starting to understand and grapple with at this point in the century. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think, as Sean alluded to, I think the key thing for me is actually to concentrate on the opportunities that are in front of Birmingham, to dwell a little less on the challenges that the city have experienced in the past, and to frame the resolution of the challenges moving forward through the lens of the opportunities that are there to seize, because they are there, and they are profound. And I would simply say this, I think, at this stage, that I do think it's good that we are working with a government that is under stress, as indeed many of us are at the moment, but that has unequivocally stated its commitment to the Midlands and to the north of England and to the wider regions of the country. And all I would say, I think, this morning is that over the next 3 to 5 years, the social and economic fortunes of Birmingham, the people of Birmingham and the wider West Midlands, for me, are the acid test of the government's commitment to that agenda. With HS2, with the Commonwealth Games, we are at the forefront of that endeavour. And my view would be to look at what happens in Birmingham and use that as the benchmark for determining whether or not the government has been successful in that endeavour. The second thing I'd say, and this comes back a little bit to the point about challenges, but I do think it's also an opportunity, is I do think that as a place, but also as a nation, we are at a certain moment in time. And, we are approaching, this makes me feel knackered and old actually, but the quarter-way mark in the 21st century, right? We sort of passed being a fifth of the way through last year. We're rapidly heading towards the quarter-way mark. And I do think that, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be when we were letting sort of fireworks off 20 so years ago on the dawn of the new millennium, if you remember all of that. At the end of history, we'd kind of cracked it. This is what we knew we had to do to kind of create sort of economically vibrant and socially diverse communities. It's been more complicated than that. And I think the three things I'd just sort of highlight from this is, one, and COVID has revealed this, I think, starkly, but I think we knew it beforehand, just how economically fragile too many of our fellow residents' lives are. And that they are never more than days, potentially weeks away from crisis. And that is an incredibly challenging and unsustainable way to live and for a city and a place to thrive. And that economic fragility, I think, as we've demonstrated through some of the demonstrations we've seen over the last week, is unevenly distributed. So it's not something that is kind of common to everybody. And people are conscious of that, they're aware of that, and I can't see a version of the future where there doesn't have to be quite a radical engagement with that uneven distribution of power and the fragility that too many people experience. The second, I think, is that what has felt like a sort of existential set of risks in recent years are now no longer existential risks, right? They are things that are actually happening to us. The pandemic's a classic example of that, but the environmental challenges that we're facing now feel like things that we absolutely have to address as part of what we do over the coming years. They aren't sorts of things that we can have interesting conversations about. We now need to sort of actively engage with those things. I was discussing recently the Commonwealth Games, which are, as you know, people know, are happening in Birmingham and the West Midlands in 2022, and just discussing, why that's been sort of reasonably challenging thing to address. And since the city was awarded the games, we've had Brexit, we've had the wettest winter on record. We've now had a global pandemic. Sort of like, what's next? And these are things that we were worried about in the past and which are now happening, and which I guess we have to address in the future. And these are things that can't simply be owned by the city council. They need to be owned by all of those who have a stake in economic growth and regeneration. The third thing I'll just say on this is, like, people these days absolutely expect to be able to have their say, for their voice to be heard for them to be engaged and for there to be a process of interaction when it comes to big decisions about their lives, right? And if there is no version of the future where that cannot happen, right? It's for the birds. And so often when we talk about this sort of the restrictions of the planning rules and all the rest of it, if there is any notion that there is a version of growth and development that is not fundamentally embedded in a conversation with people about their lives and the places that they live, that's crackers, right? And won't work. And people will find ways of stopping you doing that. And in my view, I think let's tap into that energy and that dynamism and make it work for us, rather than try to find ways of closing the doors and keeping it out. The final thing I'm going to say then, before I shut up and move on, I think, is just to say a little bit about the City Council in relation to some of the things that I've been talking about. And the mandate I've been given by the politicians, as I say, it's three and a bit weeks in, is clear. It's twofold. First is get the basics right in terms of service delivery and in relation to growth and regeneration. And then secondly, and alongside that, establish a long-term view and vision for the city. And what they mean by that, I think, is an honest assessment of where the city as a place and its people are today, and where they could and should be over the next 20 to 30 years, and then work with them to build an organisation that's capable of delivering its part in that change over the next decade or so. Some of this is complex, some of it is straightforward. So in my mind, I'll be working with Ian and others to ensure that Birmingham is a good place to do business with. And in simple terms, that means planners who answer the phone and ring you back, being clear about what it is we're wanting to achieve, but then also kind of agile and commercial in the delivery of those goals and expectations. I think it is about helping people who are wanting to work in the city understand the sort of political imperatives that are in place and work with them and support people in understanding those sorts of things. And I think finally, it's about, I think, us understanding and then working with people to explore the risks that they are experiencing when it comes to doing businesses in our part of the world, and for us to do everything we possibly can to help mitigate those risks, be they financial or otherwise. The final thing I'd say to people who sort of are just thinking, well, blimey, I look forward to that, is although on a completely different scale, this was not dissimilar to the mission that we set ourselves in East London 6 years ago. And our response to that was to look long and hard at how we see good development take place in our part of East London, and to work in a proactive, quite often challenging way with the development community, but in a very proactive way that wants to get the job done. And all I'd say to people is, like, judge us by our results. This year, London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, one of 33 London boroughs, is building 27% of all affordable housing in London. So the takeaway I give you from that is that where there is a will, where there's a vision, where there's a determination over the medium to long term to affect real change, miraculous things can happen. And I want to sort of see some of that dynamism in Birmingham over the next decade or so. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. That was fantastic. So we're going to move on to Nathan, and some comments from you, Nathan. So Nathan, Splash started at the start of the last millennium, nearly 20 years ago, and so maybe we'll get some views from you as well about what the next 20 years hold. But over to you, Nathan. That would be positive.
We're actually 26 years old, so I think this is our, if you count in COVID as a recession, we're into our third one now. So
okay, all right.
yeah, so it is it is challenging times. But I mean, for those on the webinar that don't know, we're a regeneration company. We don't call ourselves a developer, we're a regeneration company based in Manchester. Although we've always done a lot of stuff in Birmingham actually, and it's always been a real pleasure, I suppose, and quite a privilege to have been given projects like Fort Dunlop and Rotunda, and more latterly Port Loop. And what I was sort of thinking, how can I describe to the audience what we do as a business? And actually, those three projects are perfect because they're so different. Fort Dunlop's got a hotel. It's got 500,000 square feet of offices and retail and leisure space on the ground floor. Rotunda's a sort of, city centre conversion residential scheme. And then Portloop is a new kind of a new part of Ladywood, really, and it's very, very interesting and challenging opportunity, which we're on to our third phase of, working in partnership with the City Council and Canals and Rivers Trust and Great Places, who are the biggest housing association in the country. So there's a real sort of interesting mix of partners, and we're cracking on, really. And it's a very, very exciting proposition, because yes, we're trying to create a new place within an old existing sort of brownfield industrial area, but the integration and working with the local community in Ladywood is incredibly important for the success of the scheme. So we're very aware of that, and doing a number of things which we can talk about later, if to try and work that through. But sort of the COVID in the background and all the rest of it, I mean, it's strange times, really, and I think lots of people have, government and all the rest of it, had criticism for how they've handled it, but quite frankly, we're all making this one up as we go along, because it's completely unprecedented. It's new, it's challenging. There's so many different things to weigh up when making any decisions linked to this one, whether it's financial, whether it's health, whether it's getting people back to work. And we had 13 live sites across the country. I think I'm sort of slightly critical of the government. It was a little bit confusing for us as regeneration company, as to what the government was saying at times about whether we should stop, start, carry on. So we made a decision sort of late end of March to stop all of our sites, just to sort of take stock, really, and get them safe before we restarted. But we're 3 or 4 weeks back onto that now. We're trying to work as safely as possible, but it's very, very challenging. But the one thing that's really sort of come home to me anyway is that the sort of benefits of modern methods of construction have really sort of come to the forefront, actually. And we're sort of a little bit ahead of the game on this, because we've got a factory over in the East Midlands in Alfreton, where we've been building houses now for 5 or 6 years, and Portloop is a really good example of where we're delivering modular homes. And it is implementing safe working practices both on and off site, with that sort of background has been, I think, a lot easier, because it's a lot easier to control assembly lines and all the rest of it. So it's been a really interesting period for us, a very challenging period, not trying to hide behind it. And but we're very excited, and very excited about the future, and particularly excited about Birmingham, because the Portloop scheme, I mean, there's so much focus on it, both locally and nationally. For instance, we've just been shortlisted for, I think, no less than 5 awards at the Midlands Insider Awards coming up. So there's a lot of attention on this scheme, and we're really up for the challenge.
Nathan, that's fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to move to Jed. Jed, you've been in the city for a long time, I think, and you were perhaps going to talk to, I mean that in the politest possible way. And I think you were going to talk to us a little bit now about some of your reflections, perhaps what Chris and Nathan have said, but also where Birmingham has come from and where you think it's heading.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I've done nearly 30 years in the city. You can tell from my accent I wasn't actually born there. But I do consider myself a Brummie. I've married a Brummie girl, and I have 2 Brummie children. So I'm well ensconced here. So this is as light as my accent will get. I've been in that 30 years. I've done nothing but private sector planning consultancy work. So I've seen an awful lot of change, both attempting to change as well as actually the successes that have come. I'm old enough to remember walking down Broad Street when Ronnie Scott's and the Crown were the only 2 bars that you could actually go to, and Bringley Place was a Foundry Ash car park. So my reflection on the city and its successes is, so if you take Bringley Place, and we're going back a very long way, was actually the city working with the developer when a scheme fell apart in the last difficult period. The city put the land in to see that come forward. So the city and the opportunities it has always been forward thinking. This isn't something new. The other thing I always thought it was good at is, if you look at going historically, West Midlands Development Agency, you've got HCA and Midland Metro. They all work together to actually bring those elements of the city through. So the city centre and its wider connections have always been part and parcel of that. Jump till today, we've got the West Midlands now Combined Authority, we've got the West Midlands Mayor, we've got the Transport for the West Midlands, we've got Homes England. You know, all of these people are actually working very closely together. I'm trying not to steal too much of Ian's thunder, because but things like the Commonwealth Games are massive in the context of the future of the city. I don't think people understand that the significant international standing that Birmingham already has and what we need to build on. And I think that you know, from a private sector point of view, and this will lead on to Ian can reflect back on this, is that we've had political change in terms of the makeup of the council, but actually what we've also had is a dedicated focus to actually, and self-awareness of what the city needed from the politicians. So whilst it's gone from Tory to Labour, we have actually always seen a focus on placemaking, on actually regeneration and about the people of Birmingham. So that's the political side. We've also had a similar continuity, and I think really this is the city's strength, continuity in the planning leadership within the city. Now people move, but actually that continuity of focus has remained. So we had Wahid before for the last circa 10 years, having an influence. We've got Ian, Simon Delahunty, and all the area managers and the planning officers are all focused on delivery. So there isn't an inherent problem. If I was to be critical, I would say that we just haven't been able to get enough planning officers into the city to be able to transact the number of work that's looking to do it. So it's a good thing that the city remains busy and actually keen to do that. But the city has seen masses of success and delivery, and you know, Port Bloop is taking a long time to come out of the ground, but actually what's now been delivered is actually quite rightly urban design placemaking award-winning schemes, and that's where Birmingham, I think, has got its strength, because it will put in the effort to deliver what are difficult sites. It's not an easy site at all. In the last 5 years, we've probably got planning permission for circa 4,000, 5,000 apartments in the city centre. Those are different sizes. We've got one that's over 100 metres tall, so that actually is a skyscraper. And I have the advantage of having a London office. I'm head of the Birmingham office, and actually London doesn't do that many tall buildings, but in Birmingham, to actually get the city centre critical mass up and running, actually we need tall buildings that reflect the land values and the developer aspirations. So just reflecting on some of the other points, I think COVID is a moment in time. I think that Birmingham has a critical mass that we're actually building for the future already. So I think sometimes, you know, if it's 6 months or it's 18 months, if somebody buys a site today and you go through the planning process and you actually do all the viability and then you build it, you're delivering for 3 years' time. So actually the focus has to be to keep going, because what we're doing today, actually, if we have a 3-year window, so the problems of non-delivery happen in the future, not now. I think an interesting challenge in Birmingham is the move towards zero carbon. I would be concerned about viability of projects, about how we can actually get to zero carbon. I really think that that's one of the most difficult things. It's interesting that Nathan talks about modern methods of construction. I think that takes us so far, but zero carbon is a step beyond. And I'll be interested to see when we look at it in terms of what that definition is and how we achieve it. The other thing I would say, and I'll finish on this point, is that we were expecting a slight downturn in terms of Brexit. I think as a city and developers, we had actually already hardened ourselves to maybe a little bit of hardened time. I think that'll hold us in good stead for coming out of COVID. I think everybody's very positive, and I really genuinely think that the city has not lost its standing internationally or nationally.
That's fantastic, thank you. I think most of us would settle for any bar being open right now, never mind just two, but I'm sure that is on its way. Just a reminder before we move to Ian, the Q&A box is at the bottom of the screen. If you do want to ask a question, please feel free to type it in and we'll come to them very shortly. But we're going to move now to Ian. Ian, to get your reflections. You've been with Birmingham City Council for your second decade, I think you're with them now. So, you know, some of the things we've started to hear about them around sort of how cities grow and what happens next in Birmingham, doing that in a way that sort of benefits the entire population. Clearly that is a key part of your responsibilities, and it would be really welcome now to hear your views.
Yeah, I think as said when Chris joined, really, the city's in an unprecedented period of change. You know, got huge growth within the city centre. HS2 obviously now pressing ahead. Granted planning consent for the Curzon Street station a few weeks ago. We have now virtual planning committee that we've got up and running. So that's, you know, big schemes sort of pressing ahead there. And we've got the £700 million package of improvements around public realm, metro extensions, sort of connecting that within the city centre and getting the station connected out through the east of the city and then hopefully out through East Birmingham, as well as HS2, you know, major schemes like Smithfield, you know, that's £1 billion regeneration, the next sort of phase of development and adjacent to the Bull Ring and also Paradise Circus. So it's a massive period of change within the city core. I think the challenge for myself and others has always been getting that growth out into the suburbs, because it's unquestionable that although the city centre is really successful, it's how do we get the benefits there. It's very much what Chris really echoed at the start, into some of our more challenging suburbs, and we've still got large areas of deprivation, particularly within the east of the city and that sort of East Birmingham corridor, and also where Nathan talks about on that sort of western link as well. So as we head across towards Sandwell, so getting the benefits of growth from the city centre into those suburbs has been one of my sort of key objectives really. The Commonwealth Games has very much sort of presented a massive opportunity for us to regenerate a suburban area of Birmingham, you know, very much sort of once in a lifetime opportunity to get the level of funding we've been able to get from government and to inject that into Perry Bar. Perry Bar, you know, if you'd been there, you know, it's a very old centre, really in desperate need of regeneration. The old university campus, BCU, had obviously decided to relocate out of there, so it was desperately in need of regeneration. So the Games has very much offers us a great opportunity to really accelerate regeneration of Perry Bar, put in infrastructure interventions, a new station, improve public transport, and also deliver a significant uplift in the homes that the city needs. So, you know, for the Games itself, there's 1,500 homes on the Athletes Village site, and if you look at that in a wider regeneration package, you know, it's nearly 3,000 homes that will be delivered in that sort of northwest part of the city. So, you know, it's a huge sort of growth potential there, and that's really helped us to accelerate the delivery of our housing numbers beyond what we'd envisaged in the Birmingham Development Plan. But then you've still got parts like East Birmingham where, you know, the outcomes in East Birmingham are great, you know, in terms of the deprivation there. You've got poor skill levels, health challenges, and really getting people there onto a better life course is one of the key sort of challenges for us. So I think for me, getting that growth and the benefits of the city centre core growing, you know, which is actually vital to the success of the city and the wider region, but getting it into those areas is really, really important. So we've set out our growth strategy for East Birmingham, but that very much involves working with a whole range of partners to see if we can change the trajectory there, because we're never going to make the changes we need in East Birmingham just through planning alone. It's going to need to go beyond that with our partners in health, the education sector. So we're all sort of working to a common goal there, and so whether that's delivering better housing, better health services, and really getting better life outcomes within that part of the city. And I just wanted to sort of touch as well on the Ladywood area, and particularly where Nathan's has been doing a lot of great work there around with Urban Splash at McNeil Port Loop. But that's a huge sort of growth corridor as well there, and we're out currently to tender for a developer for the Ladywood estate. But if you put that into the context of the area where Nathan's been working with Urban Splash, you've got a huge growth potential there of up to about 10,000 homes. So again, that's a massive opportunity to really accelerate growth, how that links into the city centre with a canal, the bus bus services that we have there, but really get that benefit through the Western Corridor out towards Sandwell. There's a massive area and a huge regeneration opportunity for us, which and Nathan said we've already got that underway at IPL. Hopefully we can accelerate that. And I suppose my concluding comments are around the sort of COVID issue, and I'd echo what Gerald was saying. There's some real challenges there around, I think, framing the recovery from COVID. I think the two sort of key themes, are making it a green recovery. We've declared as the council our ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is a really challenging and ambitious target. But I think it shows the importance, the political importance of setting us on that sort of route to zero work. So now moving construction more towards sustainable development and pushing the sustainability of our own sort of housing stock is going to be really important. We're starting to trial now through Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust the first sort of passive house development, our first sort of carbon neutral homes, which we're hoping to get on site over the next year, but scaling that up to the level that people want to see as part of that green agenda is going to be a real challenge there. But nevertheless, it's a massive opportunity for us to do that. And then finally, I'll just say, Gerald's point on planning performance, I think we've, since I've sort of taken over as director, it's been really trying to push the planning performance of the team as a whole. And I think we've seen real improvement over the last 6 months. We've managed to have a more successful recruitment campaign, getting some staff in. But I've been really conscious of the fact that the city centre developments isn't what a lot of the residents experience in Birmingham. It's actually how we're performing with the household applications. That's the front-facing part of the service. So getting the experience of the normal Birmingham resident, and getting a more efficient planning service there has been one of my key goals. We've made real strides in terms of doing that now, and our performance has improved significantly. We need to keep that going. So, as well as the big schemes, we're offering a really good planning service to the residents of the city as well. And I'll stop there.
As you can hear, the fire alarm is going off in the background of this office that I'm in. So I'm going to ask Chris whether you can answer the question around how Birmingham will change as a result of COVID and future redevelopment. And I'll just quickly find out what's going on.
Thank you, Sean. Hopefully you don't have to.
It's gone. There you go.
Okay, brilliant.
It's off. There you go.
All right.
Okay.
So I think it's a little bit too early to say definitively. Actually, I do think that what COVID has demonstrated to us is the resilience of new ways of working, and I think the suggestion that we would go back to how we've been in the past is I think that has changed now, and certainly as a local authority we're having the big conversation about what does our office accommodation footprint need to look like moving forward, and what have we learned from this. Although I think it's absolutely premature to kind of write off the importance of a place where people can come together physically to work and to share ideas and to do those sorts of things. And while there are undoubtedly benefits of working in this way, there are quite considerable downsides, and I think people are recognising that. I think what it will mean, and if I just pick up on the point, I think the question is from Virgin Media on the Q&A. I do think while the overall footprint that people may require may reduce, I think what we are starting to discern is what does a modern workplace need to look like? What's the infrastructure that needs to be a part of that? What's the infrastructure that we need in all parts of the city for people to be able to work in those different ways? And that is absolutely, I think, about technology. But I think the other thing that this pandemic has revealed is some of the softer infrastructure. And I hesitate to use the word softer because it implies it's of less value. But I'm thinking particularly around care, just how vital the ability of parents to put their children into schools to enable them to work, the undervaluing, I think, of childcare over recent years, and how that has or hasn't enabled people to continue working through the pandemic. So I think there are some big questions about infrastructure, some of which are about physical spaces. Some of them are about how people can genuinely make best use of new technology. But I think we've also seen through this pandemic the vital importance of sort of social infrastructure to enable people to work. And if I connect that back just very briefly to this point about there being a moment in time, I just think there will be demands from people moving forward to be able to fully participate in the economy. And if they're trying to do that while also look after some children, and let's face it, quite often that is a gendered looking after children, then I don't think that's going to be sustainable. And I think we've seen that in sharp relief in recent weeks and months.
Chris, thanks very much. And I just want to perhaps group some of these questions together, because a lot of them talk around confidence. And so, Nathan, there's a question for you here around what support around the modular sector needs to maintain momentum and deliver at scale. We've talked about the games in HS2. These are big ticket items that will need confidence to continue in Birmingham, deliver the ambitions that you've set. But equally, the SME economy in Birmingham, how, in a world where people are going to be competing for investment and competing to stand out, and the decisions that you've referred to around overcoming environmental challenges and so on, all of these need a resilience in decision making and a confidence to do things differently. And so I just wonder how that sits with the City Council, with Nathan, with you in Splash, and Jed, the decisions that you'd be expecting to see around spatial planning and taking those bolder decisions that might actually define what a city is like to live in future. Maybe we have a bit of discussion around that point. And so, Nathan, maybe I can start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot in there, but I mean, to answer the first question about what support from the MMC side, I mean, modern methods and having your own factory, it's a tough gig actually, and I'm not. I think one of the reasons that it hasn't really taken off in the UK is that it's a long-term game. If I hear or see another developer saying they're going to use modular construction to save time and save money, it's just they're completely misguided. It's a long game, and it requires significant amounts of investment and patience, and there's a lot of learning and all the rest of it. So it's very, very difficult. Now, what we did a year ago actually, was we partnered up with Sekisui House, who are the biggest actually house builder in the world, 20 billion turnover, do 40,000 homes a year, a huge outfit, Japanese, and they took a 35% stake in our housing business, which is part of the vehicle for delivering down at Port Loop. And what they bring is, yes, they bring some finance, but that developers can raise finance anywhere, if you're any good. But what they brought, and what was really interesting for us, is they brought expertise and a history of building quality in factories, and we're embedding them in. They've got sort of 5 full-time people over from Japan now that are all fully integrated into our business, and we're learning off each other really. So that's really interesting, but it's not an in and out thing, MMC, particularly with what we do, because we're sort of category 1 in Homes England's MMC categories really, in that we're the sort of most extreme MMC, given that we bring the whole modules completed to site. So yeah, it's a challenging time, and it does require a lot of local and government, national government support. It really does. And Homes England have also taken a small stake in our housing business as well, to help offer that support and expertise. I think just one other point I'd say is on the sort of zero carbon side. I mean, I don't know if you're going to come onto that as a specific subject, but it's something we feel really strongly about as a business. And sort of my take on it all, and it'll sort of make some people shudder really, is it has to come through legislation, because it's and that might be local, that might be through planning or whatever, but and I'm probably talking ourselves into a more costly development here, but we will find a way as an industry if planning and national government set very, very stringent targets. And I worry a bit when developers use margins and things to try and get out of doing it, I have to say, because we'll find a way as an industry, but it needs very, very clear and strong legislation. If it's not legislated properly, in terms of what we have to deliver, then land values will still go as high as possible, and speculators will sell their land for as much as possible. And the problem with that is the lowest build cost wins in terms of who can get to the highest land value. So that does that does harm it. So yeah, I really encourage Birmingham. I love the fact they've committed to 2030. I would encourage them to go a step further in planning and be very, very stringent on what they're asking for, and perhaps even set a zero carbon target for all new homes by even an earlier date than that. And we welcome it as a business, because we're going to be setting some very clear targets ourselves to deliver zero carbon homes. We have to define what zero carbon means, and I think Gerald touched on that before, and perhaps we'll come on to that. But it's for me, that's one of the biggest outcomes of COVID, is that I think we as an industry, we can really sort of think, how can we do something a lot better? How can we sort of help change things going forward? And I think that's one of the things we can hit head on in a really sort of distinct way of getting outputs.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Nathan. So, Ian, can I come to you, because it's sort of linked to that. Nathan's just talked about 2030. There's a question from Mark Jenkinson, talks around the challenges and opportunities that you mentioned in your opening reflections around the climate emergency declaration. So what do you think those challenges and opportunities are, and that plan coming together? And I suppose to link that to that point around confidence to do things differently would be great to get your view on that.
I think Nathan summed that up pretty well there, actually. It does need national legislation to push the building standards. We tried in the Birmingham Development Plan Review to set more accelerated targets for sustainable construction, but ironically, those were sort of watered down through the planning process, often on the grounds that Nathan actually talked about. The inspector was concerned about viability. Is that going to affect your affordable housing? So he tended to sort of pull back on some of those targets. So I do think it's important you get that sort of national push on building standards. So, they set the sort of benchmark, and you're never going to get the scale of sustainable construction unless you really sort of push the standards nationally. So I think it's really important that you get the national framework correct, and that was sort of filtered down then into local plans, and we'll be able to push things from there. But there's certainly lots of opportunity around modular construction. We're looking at some of those opportunities for the Commonwealth Games on some of the plots that we've got to bring forward there. The modular schemes that we've seen at Icknield Port Loop have been really good quality developments there. So I think getting that scale of construction will enable us to push the sustainability agenda.
Great, thanks very much. And Judd, to you, there's a question here from Brian and Martin around planning now for the future despite COVID. So how can we ensure that businesses have the confidence to invest now for the future development, given the uncertainty and clearly the role that you were playing there?
Well, I think we've touched upon actually the reasons that I think, if we look back and forward, Birmingham has actually significant under-delivered in housing for a substantial number of years, and there's an undersupply across the city. So depending on how you want to throw the numbers, it could be 50 to 70,000. So, we're talking about an under-provision here. So you can have confidence that there is demand. We've got HS2 and Commonwealth Games, but I think the other elements are that, and this is out of COVID as well as Brexit, is that big businesses that were mainly based in London are now actually looking to relocate to Birmingham or have relocated. So we've got HSBC headquarters now on Broad Street. We've got Sainsbury's coming into Coventry. We've got Jaguar Land Rover here. We've got all of the other elements of it. We are the Midlands engine. COVID is a new way of working, but it isn't the same as not working. And I'm sure Nathan knows that actually, people want to live in Birmingham. One of the questions, Bryony, I think a really good statistic for Birmingham is that 49% of its students that come here, and so outside of the city, actually stay. 49%. So the city has something to offer. I think we are a proper alternative to London. When HS2 comes, actually, and not that it's a speed way to get it, but actually the connections are going to be so regular that actually the London elements of actually that international type of working as well, the creation of those high quality jobs, they're coming to the city, they're coming to the Midlands, and actually that's why I have confidence. So COVID is a new way of living in terms of, but I think that's where the confidence is. There's so much positive and massive infrastructure that it's there that we can take advantage of. And I don't think we should shy away from that.
Thanks very much. Maybe we can just build on that point a little bit then around the skills ecosystem. So universities, higher education, further education. So with these big ticket things that are happening in Birmingham, the jobs that are arriving, I suppose there's a couple of questions in the Q&A around STEM skills development in Birmingham and see whether examples of diversity initiatives. And there are all the city's universities will play in regeneration. And if you think about universities, both as having huge estates and huge spend, but also being clearly key providers of skills to the local population, that ecosystem and getting it to work is going to be particularly important. And Chris, I don't know from your perspective, in terms of some of the things we've touched on around making sure the population of Birmingham is able to take advantage of some of these fantastic initiatives that are occurring in the city. Your view on the role of the skills system and universities would be really helpful. And then perhaps Ian and Jed, you could comment on the role that the university estates will play in the wider sort of development of the city.
Yeah, well, I guess my sort of opening point, it sort of builds on Jed's really, is that let's just not underestimate the extent to which those actors are playing their full part right now, actually. So we're building on something, not having to kind of start from scratch on it. I mean, I suppose there's sort of two observations really. I think we've quite often in this morning come back to the extent to which support from central government will be key in all of this. I think for many years, many of us have been making the argument around much greater regional and sub-regional freedoms and flexibilities to kind of understand what is the kind of skills gap in our local areas, take a long-term perspective on that, and through more local partnerships, build the right infrastructure we need to fill those gaps over the short, long, and medium term. And I mean, I think that's been the case for many years now. And I think as we go into the post-COVID period of recovery, it's absolutely essential that those freedoms and flexibilities come to the West Midlands and come to Birmingham, because I think that's the missing bit that enables all of the actors to come together and really plan for the future. I suppose there's two bits I draw out from that. The first, I think, is us taking as broad a possible view as possible about what we understand the skills gap to be. And I absolutely recognise that STEM skills are going to be crucial, but I also would not want to underestimate the absolute vital importance over the next couple of decades around care, caregiving, and some of those things that have suddenly revealed themselves to be vital in the last 12 weeks or so. And so I think that's a key observation, and exactly where we locate that conversation in our infrastructure locally, I think is one that we need to kind of ask, understand, and then do something about. And then I think this point about diversity, I mean, for me, I think it's a more fundamental question, which is we quite often talk about hard to reach groups in our community, people where there's kind of intergenerational poverty, lack of economic opportunities for those folk. And we often refer to these as kind of hard to reach groups. I mean, I sort of think they're kind of hidden in plain sight, actually. And we need to kind of double down now on our efforts to kind of understand what are the barriers that stop those parts of our population from playing a full and active role in their lives, in the economy of the West Midlands and of Birmingham. And we have to just absolutely nail a kind of a theory of change as to how we're going to work with those people over the next decades to bind them into the economic prospects of this place. I don't think it's good enough for it simply to be about kind of supply side measures. I do think we need to kind of understand the detail of their lives and work with them over the short, medium, and long term. And that has to be the benchmark of our success. Frankly, it cannot be that we are attracting another massive business into the city centre. And I think that it's essential but not sufficient, right? The test has to be, are the economic fortunes of the most vulnerable changing and transforming over the next decade? Not least because as a nation, we simply cannot afford to deal with the consequences of people being left behind.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got quite a few questions to run through. So I'm going to try and get through each of these as quickly as we can so we get them answered. So Ian, I'm going to come to you. And this is a question from Mike Best around, I do know very well the experience of spatial frameworks in Greater Manchester and how difficult they are to achieve, but I'm sure we'll get there. But nevertheless, so most commentators, we need a return to strategic planning. How and when, and I think this is in the context of a wider West Midlands, not just Birmingham, but in making sure that the entire West Midlands works together to get a strategic approach to housing, employment and infrastructure. Ian, your view on that?
Yeah, I think obviously when the combined authority was set up, the sort of decisions were made not to transfer any planning powers over to the combined authority. So it doesn't have the same spatial planning powers as what you have in Manchester, where they can put more. So there's no ability for the combined authority to put a statutory planning framework in place. I think what I would say is, even though that does make planning with neighbours more difficult, because ideally, I think professionally, I'd probably prefer to see a sort of strategic plan that set targets for housing at that level that other authorities could adhere to. But what you have seen, nevertheless, particularly in terms of the Birmingham housing shortfall, is authorities have really responded to the challenges that we've had. So in spite of the lack of that framework, the message that we need to accelerate housing growth and increase supply has still happened, and a lot of our neighbours have responded really, really positively through the Duties Cooperate to boost housing supply. And a lot of the housing shortfall that Birmingham had when we did our development plan, which was nearly 38,000 dwellings, has now been met by either the city council increasing supply or its neighbours boosting supply. So although in an ideal world you'd have that sort of spatial framework there, the fact that it isn't, hasn't stopped local authorities responding positively and responding to the demand and the need for additional housing. And I think the same will be on employment land as well, which I think will take on more importance now as we get into the economic recovery as well.
Thanks very much, Ian. I think Jed, maybe linked to that is Tom Horn's question. So this is around a review of planning levels, bureaucracy, and so on. And if you're going to have a genuine recovery, what do you think needs to change in how we plan for buildings and cities as we go forward? And then Nathan, perhaps get some thoughts from you on that one as well.
All right. I think we're doing a good job planning wise. I think I think Nathan made a brilliant point about needing government guidance. I worry for the city that if we bring in standards that are higher than elsewhere, so that it costs more to build in Birmingham rather than Manchester, that significant investment will be lost to other cities. So there's a balance to be walked in all of this. I want to see Birmingham built in the same way it's gone over the last 15 years for the next 15 years, because it's a critical mass and infrastructure relationship with all the people of Birmingham that actually we can't lose. Because once we have HS2, once we have all these connections, we don't lose them, we just use them. And I think, we're living, the Commonwealth Games is going to bring that out. But I do really feel that the loss of the Regional Development Agency has actually put us back and created a vacuum that we're only starting to come back out of. And actually, fair play to the planners and the politicians, they have all worked well together. But actually, if you want to make, the 20, 30 year projections, you really need strategic planning in place that actually there's no doubt about where we're going, because we have to take ourselves out of political change and actually just have it that that's where we're going.
Nathan, would been at the forefront of sort of innovative regeneration schemes over many decades. And what do you need to see from Birmingham in the coming years ahead?
It's quite planning generally. I think that I think it's in the worst mess it's ever been, quite honestly, if I'm being completely open. Now, our experiences in Birmingham are slightly different, because when we were selected, Port Loup had an outline consent, and we've worked very, very closely with the city on doing the reserve matters, etc. So our experience actually in Birmingham are very positive. I'm delighted to say, given the panelists. But the overall, nationally, we are struggling. I mean, there's a whole series of reasons for that. One might be that sometimes we're building housing in city centres or close to city centres, and often the council won't have a policy for house building, and they'll apply a Didsbury standard or a Harborne standard in a city centre, and that's really problematic. It's got to be X meters overlooking all that sort of stuff, but they're just, for me, just irrelevant for city centre dense living. And I suppose that takes us on to Portloe, really, is that we could probably make more returns, more money, if we went more high density and build apartments and all the rest of it. But what we sort of want to do, really, is there's a lot of people in the city centre in Birmingham that want to live close to the city centre, but perhaps have a family, perhaps want an outside space, but still want to get quick access. And I think, historically they would have moved to the Harbornes or to the Sutton Coldfields or whatever. And I think that's what we're providing, is that choice for people that actually live in the city centre or want to live in the city centre now, but it's actually got that variety of space, really. And as I said, the planning's been positive so far, but it is difficult. We tried something out, and we've not talked about it. We tried something out at Portloe that we've never done before. We tried a communal garden for 40 houses. We've never done it. I think it's very rarely been done in the city centre. And the idea that you get a sort of defensible 3-metre space, and then the rest of it's a communal gardens where kids can actually go and play with their neighbours, and stuff like that. We completely tried it out, sold out on that scheme. So it's a test that we've happily done working with Ian and the team in Birmingham, and it's something we'll roll out nationally because it's been an incredible success. And I think COVID's actually really brought that out, is that you do want that outside space and that interaction, albeit at 2 meters.
That famous 2 meters that we're now accustomed to. Chris, I'm gonna finish this last question on you, and then we're going to run out of time. But it sort of links to that point that Nathan was just making around places to live. So this is the question, and I know you're into your music. So the music and arts sector, often the first to lose funding in an economic downturn. What are your thoughts on Birmingham as a place to live with cultural activities? And that.
Okay, that's a really good question. And well, look, I think there is, I'm going to link it to a point that Ian made earlier on, actually, because I think this point about how we ensure that growth works for all parts of the city, I think these things connect through. And in particular, how we are supporting those suburban areas where I think for too many people it's felt like, while they've seen tremendous positive change take place in the centre of the city, they would be forgiven, I think, for feeling that their area has declined in recent years. I think that would be a sense that many people have. And so it's understanding how we kind of get economically viable change taking place in some of those parts is important. I just connect that to the arts and culture for a moment. I do think it's going to be tremendously difficult for the city council, which is itself under kind of financial stress, to be the kind of the backstop support here. And I do think we need to kind of understand what the needs of that sector are, advocate for it in the short to medium term, and do whatever we possibly can to retain the sustainability of what's already there. I think long term, I do think there is a question about how the city council and other partners can take a deeply long-term perspective on how we support artists and the cultural sector to thrive, with a long-term view about the accommodation they need, where artists can live, where they can work, how they can do what they do. The kind of traditional pattern of them sort of occupying areas pre-gentrification cannot be sustainable, and we need to think about, if they are a core part of our economy and what it means to live in a place, how do we build and sustain places for them over the long to medium term?
Chris, thank you very much for that, and what a fantastic set of comments to finish on. So we are going to close this webinar shortly. I hope that everyone has enjoyed the debate. I think it's been wide-ranging, and some really interesting thoughts that have come out. So Nathan, Jed, Ian, Chris, thank you for that. And just finally, from me, Creatus is hosting our next webinar on the 24th of June at 2:30 p.m, where our own Helen Tilton will be in conversation with the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. So hopefully we can have people join us for that. And until then, I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us. Thank you for having a coffee with Kratos this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Cheers.